This is lesson 12.1, designing a survey. Our objectives for today are to define a population and a sample, to define different types of sampling, to define different types of studies and collect data, and to define bias and how it can alter data. So what is a population? A population is everything or everyone being studied. Populations can be of any size, but should include all of what we are curious about. Okay, so some examples, if you wanted to know the average weight of all 20-year-old males in the US, the population is all men who are 20 years old and living in the US, like every single one, okay? The population is the entire group being studied. To know the mean IQ of all 10-year-old students in Canada, the population is every single 10-year-old student who lives in Canada. Okay, so populations are large, they're the entire group. So obviously, populations usually contain too many elements to realistically include them all, right? You can't actually survey every single student in Canada kind of thing. So we use just a sample of a population. So an example, instead of polling every single student in the entire school, we poll a sample of just 10 students from every class, right? Another example, instead of testing every single cell in your body for a genetic anomaly, we scrape a sample from a possible tumor, right? So samples are used all the time. We never use the entire population unless it happens to be small. We take samples. Okay, so what types of samples are there? There's a convenient sample, a self-selected sample, a systematic sample, and a random sample. Let's talk about each one. So a convenient sample is any members of a population who are conveniently and readily available. Okay, so an example is you stand outside a store and survey people as they enter the store. They're just people who are conveniently there, right? So if you're trying to study a population of everyone who shops at Smith's, for example, right? You do a convenience sample by standing outside one day and surveying just like 1 hour worth of people who shop there, okay? A self-selected sample is members of the population who volunteered for the sample. So an example would be like phone-in polls, right? Like you post a thing, I want to do a study on this, please give me a call if you're willing to participate, okay? So it's a self-selected, the participants select themselves. Next one is a systematic sample. In this one, the population is ordered some way and then selected from it at regular intervals. So example, you take every 10th name from the phone book and call those people, right? Put everybody in alphabetical order, pick every 10, kind of thing like that, right? So it's systematic. You're making a pattern for how you're going to select. And then random sample, all members of the population are equally likely to be chosen because you're selecting randomly. So for this one, you would assign every member of the population a number and then use some kind of random digit table or a random number generator in order to select members. So this is randomly, right? So like putting names in a hat and drawing them out, that kind of thing, right? So it's random. All right, so which kind of sample do you think would best represent the population, right? Oh, and we're not going to do an upcoming project, so ignore that one anyway. So out of all the types of samples, the random sample is like the gold standard of sampling, right? The random sample is supposed to give you the best representation of the actual population. All right, so sampling is the method of how we select the group, and a study is the method of collecting data, right? So you identify your problem that you're trying to study and your population, and you take a sampling of people and then perform a study to collect your data. All right, now here, what are the different types of studies? So we have survey. Every member of the sample is asked a set of questions, or it can even just be one question. You have an observational study where members are observed in a way that they are not affected by the study. So that's important, you know. So there's questions like in animal studies and things. if the animals notice that they're being observed, does that actually change the animal's behavior, right? So in an observational study, we try to observe in a way that is like not actually affecting the behavior that we're trying to study, like secret observation kind of thing. And then finally, there's a controlled experiment. So this is where you divide samples into 2 or more groups, and you give one group a treatment and the other one does not get a treatment, and then you compare your results. So like if I as a teacher wanted to test out different teaching methods, right? I could teach with one method on first period and a different method with second period, and then give them a test at the end and see which group did better, right? So that's an experiment. Okay, so next we're going to talk about bias. So bias is what happens if you sample your population and for some reason a part of the population is overrepresented or underrepresented. Okay, so the convenience and self-selected and systematic sampling methods are more likely to have bias because you're not randomly selecting out of the population. Okay, so like especially the self-selected, that one's going to have the most bias because those were people who volunteered to do the study, so they might have an agenda or a reason why they volunteered. They're more likely to put bias into the study. You can also get bias in the way the data is collected, the survey, the observation, the experiment, like the observation one that I talked about before. If for some reason the way that the observers are observing somehow affects the behavior of the thing that they're studying, then obviously that is now biased. Okay, so which sampling method is the most likely to introduce a bias? That's the self-selected, right? Because people are selecting themselves, so they might have an agenda or a reason, and the random sample is the least likely. All right, so here's an example in our real world. The only people getting tested for COVID-19 are people who have severe enough symptoms that they decide to go to the hospital to get tested. Does the sample have a bias? Well, yes, it does, right? So there might be lots of people that actually have it that have very few symptoms or no symptoms, and so they might not even realize they have it. And so this is creating an inaccurate count right now in the media, right? So how did this bias alter the results? It's what we just said. We're getting an inaccurate counts in the media, and that is not very helpful when scientists are trying to figure out the trends, right? So what could be done to reduce the amount of bias? They've said this in the news. This is why you hear in the news that there should be a lot more testing, right? Test random samples of people. You've heard that in the news, and there are some countries that have done that, but they're much smaller than the United States. The huge size of the United States is making this difficult for them to do. Bias can also be created through the way the data is collected. So for example, if you did a survey question that said, don't you think it would be a great investment in our future to provide COVID-19 tests for everyone? Versus, aren't you tired of paying tax money out of your pocket to bail out people who are laid off right now? See, these survey questions are biased in the way they're presenting the question. So you have to make sure that when you create a survey question, you don't make a question that obviously is leaning towards one opinion, right? So let's say you're trying to do a study about the connection between testing positive for COVID-19 and where people traveled recently. Could we write a survey question with minimized bias and one with maximized bias? All right, so let's try this. So if we want to write a survey question about where people traveled, right? So let's say we said, you know, have you experienced any symptoms, right? Symptoms. And then you could ask, have you traveled recently, right? Okay, and then with maximized bias. So if you want maximized bias, you could be like, you know, did you travel to China and places that have a high rate of infection? And, you know, so have you been traveling to highly infected places, right? And then you could say, like, do you have even a little bit of symptoms, right? Make it more biased of what you're kind of looking for, sort of thing. All right. So example, to survey people for symptoms of COVID-19, a pop-up survey comes up for people who log into Facebook. This happened to me. I got one of these. What sampling method is being used, right? So this one is actually a convenience sample. I don't know if I spelled that. Convenience, right? I'm a math teacher for a reason, you guys. Convenience. Convenience. There we go. So it's a convenience sample because they are just, when people log on to Facebook, it pops up, right? It's convenient. And then what study method is being used? And this one is a survey. So does a potential bias exist? Yes, because it's a convenient sample. Right? Oh, I just misspelled that again. Convenience. And then also it is self-selected because you can choose to close the survey and not answer it. Right? Also self-selected. So perhaps people who feel like they are having some symptoms might be more likely to answer the survey, right? And that's going to like affect how many people are answering it. So what could be done to minimize the bias, right? So instead try to give the survey randomly. And then also, I don't know if you could do anything about the self-selected because people wouldn't like it, right? If they logged onto their Facebook accounts and they were forced to answer the survey, but at least try to give the survey randomly. All right, so that's the end. Try the homework paper, and we'll see you guys next time.